A young San Francisco entrepreneur imprisoned in China for nearly a month. He says he didn't know where he was and if he would get out alive. The Biden administration extends former President Trump's sanctions on Hong Kong for another year, and Beijing criticizes the U.S. for making mistakes on top of mistakes. A Chinese company halts its over $200 million plans to go public on the U.S. stock market. It's the first Chinese firm to make the move since Beijing started cracking down on tech companies. Heavy rains are drenching regions across China. In Shanghai, the sky suddenly turned dark in the early afternoon and heavy rains began. And an 86-year-old scientist beaten by a Chinese aerospace executive. A letter she wrote reveals her side of the story. Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Do not go. That was the only thought in one young entrepreneur's mind when he finally reunited with his family in the United States. Before that, he had been kidnapped and locked away in a Chinese prison cell. NTD's Paul Graney spoke with the entrepreneur to learn about his experience there.
1 Minute American Stephen Scherer was a successful young entrepreneur, co-founding a business in Beijing, China. The next, he's falsely and arbitrarily accused of illegal employment by the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP. After that, he's kidnapped, locked in the back of a prison transport vehicle, and taken to a black site prison compound in Beijing. Inside, he endured the regime's detention and torture methods for nearly a month. That's before China's communist authorities eventually deported him. Scherer returned to the United States in 2016. He arrived home extremely malnourished, sick, and horrifically sleep-deprived. But he says he felt lucky to be alive. NTD interviewed Mr. Scherer to get his first-hand account of the experience.
To begin with, do you have any idea why you specifically were targeted?
There's a lot of different assumptions that can be made as to why I was detained and thrown into a black site prison cell in Beijing. One of the kind of common themes is what does the CCP do with a foreigner who is in China? So if you're familiar with China, the concept of face is very important. And so this kind of equivalence is pushed heavily by the CCP. So there's a heavy level of disconnect between what the Chinese are able to do with a foreigner like myself, who becomes influential, who has a huge network and following, and is successful in the country. How do you handle a kind of independent voice, an independent person who may not agree with the Chinese narrative that's pushed by the CCP? So you have to make those people disappear, and that's what the CCP likely did with me. They made me disappear.
Were you dissenting? Were you doing things that the CCP didn't like?
So it's hard to say. With things like the social credit system, there is a quantified number next to your existence. And this is not only true if you're a Chinese national, but this is also true if you're a foreign national. So I did post things like on July 4th when I was living and working in China about, kind of celebrating being an American and being supportive of the US military. So even tiny things like that may be seen as an affront to the national stability of China, where there is a China forward kind of centric narrative, and other countries like the United States are supposed to be kind of these, broken societal systems that are violent and all these other things.
Did they mention any of this to you when they arrested you? Did they give you a specific reason?
So what I was formally charged with after about a full day in a holding facility was illegal employment, and that was the formal charge. But what was very odd was when I was detained and went through hours of interrogations by myself is the Chinese police routinely referenced the amount of money I made. So they would look at my tax documentation, and one of the odd questions I got from the Chinese police, and I wrote about this in the book, was they kept saying, "Do you know how much money you make in the country?" And I said, "Yes. I mean, I have my tax documentation right here. I do everything legally. I'm here above board. I have a legal alien permit, legal work visa." And they said, "Well, do you know how much we make?" And I said, "No, I don't understand where the connection is between those two things." And then the kind of implication from that line of questioning over and over and over again was, you as a foreigner should not be making more than a domestic Chinese national. And that was kind of the logic of the interrogation for a good chunk of the discussion.
Here in the States, if you get arrested for anything, there's due process, right? You get some options, you get to call a solicitor, call a friend, et cetera, et cetera. What kind of options did they give you?
When I spoke to people in Western Europe or in the United States, North America really, and I shared my story, there wasn't a point of reference. People would often ask, well, hey, why didn't you call an attorney, as if that were an option, not understanding that we're talking about a country, according to Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, that kills more of its own citizens every single year than the rest of the world combined. And so we're talking about a country where Falun Gong practitioners, Chinese Christians, Muslim Uyghurs, political dissidents, human rights attorneys are routinely detained, tortured, and executed. So there is no due process, there is no phone call, there is no bail, there are no Miranda rights, no human rights organizations. There is nothing in terms of judicial process to help you as a mechanism to defend yourself once you're detained. It's an overnight abduction. You're thrown into a cage, you're carted around and forced to undergo a litany of odd and strange medical tests against your will before being thrown into a black site prison cell where all of your belongings are taken from you, and you are essentially at the extreme end of what is now becoming common here in the United States, which is cancel cultured, but to the point where you are abducted and disappeared by the government and you no longer exist.
You were running your own business at the time in Beijing. I believe it was going quite well for you. You want to take us through how things changed for you, this change of environment and change of situation? How did it make you feel?
Yeah, so I went from living right outside of the kind of cosmopolitan district of very central Guomao in Beijing, and I was living a pretty decent life. I was able to kind of run a company. I had my friends, I had my network, I had my own business, and it was a very kind of proud accomplishment. And I went from that to essentially being told to get into a cage. And you're locked in a cage 24 hours a day. You don't get the hour of sunlight. You are locked in there with 17 other inmates. You're sleeping on kind of frozen wooden planks with blood-stained blankets. You are sharing a single squatter toilet, and then you're eating essentially yellow sludge out of a communal trough. There's a bucket where this kind of sludge is poured through the metal bars and into a bucket, and 17 inmates share that. You're forcibly sleep deprived. You're heavily malnourished. I was routinely pulled out of my prison cell by guards to translate for other foreign inmates who had stopped eating. And again, these conditions are designed to kill you. There are suicide warning signs plastered on the wall. It's incredibly dangerous, and you see people literally kind of disappear or lose their mind or suffer horrendously in a number of different ways every single day.
Chinese authorities imposed a 3-year travel ban on Scherer, blocking him from re-entry into China. Scherer says he has no plans to go back anytime soon.
Beijing is slamming the U.S. for meeting with Uyghur survivors of the Xinjiang internment camps in China. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken met virtually on Tuesday with former detainees and advocates to hear about their experiences. The Chinese Foreign Ministry said on Wednesday that the U.S. would never succeed in what they called disrupting Xinjiang with human rights issues. They again rejected allegations of human rights abuses, describing them as U.S. lies and rumors that have fallen apart. The international community has been criticizing and sanctioning Beijing over human rights abuses in Xinjiang. The CCP has detained more than 1 million Uyghurs and other minorities in the region for what they call political re-education. The detainees are not formally charged with any crime, but many believe that the CCP may see them as disloyal to the party. That's due to their religious and linguistic differences. Both the Trump and the Biden administrations have termed Beijing's campaign in Xinjiang a genocide. Then U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has also met several times with former Uyghur camp detainees. U.S. President Biden announced Wednesday to extend former President Trump's sanctions against Hong Kong. Trump's executive order last July declared a state of emergency regarding Hong Kong's situation, and it eliminated the city's special status, meaning the U.S. will treat Hong Kong the same way it treats any Chinese city. Trump signed the order in accordance with the U.S. National Emergencies Act. He stated that Beijing's actions fundamentally undermine Hong Kong's autonomy and pose an unusual and extraordinary threat to U.S.'s national security, foreign policy, and economy. Biden copied Trump's exact words and declared, for this reason, the national emergency declared on July 14, 2020, must continue in effect beyond July 14, 2021. Based on the executive order, the U.S. sanctioned last year a number of officials, including Hong Kong officials implementing the national security law and leaders of the Hong Kong police force. China's Foreign Ministry commissioner in Hong Kong responded on Thursday, claiming that the U.S. has shown no remorse for its actions and makes mistakes on top of mistakes. Chinese medical data group LinkDoc has halted its plans to go public on U.S. stock markets. That's according to Reuters sources, and it has to do with Beijing's clampdown on overseas listings by Chinese firms. If the company's initial public offering or IPO was issued, it would raise $211 million from the public. Chinese regulators recently toughened their oversight and banned Chinese ride-hailing giant Didi from app stores. LinkDoc is the first Chinese firm known to have pulled back its U.S. IPO plans since then. Analysts say others are likely to follow LinkDoc's decision to pull its IPO. Morgan Stanley, Bank of America, and China International Capital Corp were the investment banks on the deal, and they all declined to comment. Alibaba backs LinkDoc and was due to price its shares after the U.S. market closes today. U.S. capital markets have been a lucrative source of funding for Chinese firms in the past decade. Dozens of Chinese firms have raised a total of $12.5 billion in the U.S. so far this year. Beijing is tightening its control over payment service companies. China's central bank said on Thursday that anti-monopoly measures applied to e-commerce giant Ant Group will also be imposed on other companies. Jack Ma's Alibaba backs Ant Group. Beijing's regulations against Ant Group began last November. The regime suspended the group's planned $37 billion listing. This April, Chinese regulators imposed a sweeping restructuring on the fintech giant. They forced it to cut links between its payments app Alipay and its other businesses. Regulators cited monopolistic behavior. The vice governor of China's central bank said the same behavior also exists in other companies. He added that countermeasures would be revealed soon. Alipay and WeChat Pay currently dominate China's online payment industry. Coming up, heavy rains have been drenching regions across China. In Shanghai, the sky suddenly turned dark early in the afternoon, and heavy rains poured down. More on that after the break.
Don't let YouTube decide what information you get. That's your choice. YouTube is deleting our videos and cuts you off from a source of honest reporting. Make sure you don't lose access to NTD's news content, and take a quick moment to subscribe to our newsletter so no matter what happens here, you'll keep your access to a trustworthy news source.
Heavy rains have been drenching South China and parts of North China since Wednesday. In Shanghai, the sky suddenly turned dark early Thursday afternoon, and heavy rains poured down on the financial hub. A local resident recorded how quickly the clouds moved in the sky. The video on social media shocked many. When residents looked out their windows, they couldn't make out most of the objects outside due to the rain. Drivers could hardly see the cars in front of them. In North China's Shijiazhuang City, local authorities issued 5 warnings in about 2 hours on Wednesday. They include warnings for thunder, lightning, strong winds, hail, and rainstorms. The rain reached over 2 inches in a few hours in parts of the city. The hashtag of the news made it onto the trending topics list on Chinese social media Weibo. The strong wind uprooted many trees, and the storms interrupted traffic in 5 tunnels and bridges. Residents posted on social media saying they had a power and water outage that lasted late into the night. Another resident said he hasn't seen this kind of rain in 2 decades. According to Chinese media, heavy rains have been drenching over 13 provinces and regions in China starting Thursday, and they will last until Friday morning. A letter written by an 86-year-old Chinese scientist is causing a stir online. Her name is Wu Meirong. She was attacked last month by a Chinese Communist Party secretary. The man serves as an executive of a state-owned aerospace company. Her letter revealed that her assault was even worse than surveillance video showed. Security cameras captured the incident, and the footage was posted online last week. The clip shows the executive Zhang Tao attacking the elderly scientist for around half an hour. He also shoved a second scientist who was present. Tuesday, a letter from Wu was shared on Chinese social media platform Weibo. In it, she explained Zhang actually attacked her twice. She went on to write that he had thrown her across the room, sending her tumbling approximately 15 feet away. She also said Zhang had grabbed her and forcefully shoved her onto the ground, breaking her spine. Her description contradicts an earlier statement about the incident released by Zhang's aerospace company. That information had claimed Zhang didn't attack the elderly woman. Wu later described her injuries. She wrote, "My spine was broken, and the soft tissues in my body were contused. I have swelling. It's extremely painful. I'm unable to move. After the operation, my heart rhythm became abnormal, and I got a high fever. I suffered all the pain of my whole life dozens of times over." The incident struck after Zhang invited Wu and the other scientists to dinner. He expected the two scientists to give him a recommendation needed to join an international astronautics organization. He became violent after they denied his request. More than 10 Shanghai residents were detained on the CCP's 100th anniversary. That's because they visited a 90-year-old woman at her home and mourned her late son, who was a human rights defender.
The CCP's anniversary this year, or July 1st, was also the 14th anniversary of Chinese rights defender Chen Xiaoming's death. 11 petitioners visited Chen's home in Shanghai to commemorate his death, together with his 90-year-old mother. But just as they were about to leave, Shanghai police arrested and detained them.
We go there every year. Chen's sister also comes to commemorate my mother-in-law's anniversary every year. Our personal relationship is very good. Every July 1st, on Chen's anniversary, I go to visit them every year.
Petitioners are people in China who think they have been treated unfairly by authorities and are unable to get their grievances addressed by the judicial system. This is why some of them go to local petition bureaus to file their complaints. Most of the cases, however, are left unsolved. Chen was famous among them. Authorities forcibly demolished Chen and his family's house in 1994. Chen then taught himself law, went to court against the authorities, and eventually won. Chen became well known because it was rare for petitioners to win in court. Many other rights defenders started asking him to represent them in their legal cases. But this angered the authorities. In the end, Chen was sentenced to 2 years in prison for so-called disrupting court order. On July 1st, 2007, Chen died after having gone through severe torture in detention. And on July 1st each year, rights defenders from Shanghai would visit his elderly mother. One of the 11 petitioners, Zhang Xiaoqu, went through similar tribulations as Chen did. 16 years ago, Shanghai authorities forcibly demolished the house of her 80-year-old mother-in-law. The old lady was detained and eventually died in prison. Another petitioner, Huang Yuehua, was also among the detained on July 1st, and she was released 5 days later. She is also a victim of forced demolition.
This time I stayed away from them for a month. I didn't go out. I knew someone in the alley was watching and stopping me from going out. I didn't even go downstairs, so they couldn't detain me. I didn't expect that I would be arrested when I went there on July 1st, and I was detained for so many days.
And Mao Hengfeng was also among the 11. She is a victim of the one-child policy. Authorities put her into a mental hospital and tortured her in a labor camp, all for having a second child. Mao said she feels helpless and hopes that people's basic rights can't get protected.
Are Chinese CCP virus vaccines effective? A series of reports on the latest global outbreak is suggesting maybe not. That's according to a CNBC analysis on Wednesday. It shows among 6 countries with both high vaccination and high infection rates, 5 of them are relying on Chinese vaccines. They are the United Arab Emirates, Seychelles, Mongolia, Uruguay, and Chile. The one country that doesn't depend on Chinese vaccines is the UK. And more concerns are growing over the efficacy of Chinese vaccines. Indonesia reported hundreds of infections among healthcare workers who took Chinese vaccines, and over a third of them have died. That's including the country's lead scientist on China's Sinovac vaccine trials. A local news service said she died of suspected CCP virus on Wednesday. In China, the southwestern city of Ruili has a 97% vaccination rate, but it is still battling a new surge in infections. And hard-hit Costa Rica is rejecting Sinovac vaccines, fearing that they won't work. Singapore is taking a similar move. Authorities there are excluding China's Sinovac jabs from the national vaccination tally. Only people who have taken the U.S.-made Moderna or Pfizer shots are reflected in Singapore's overall vaccination numbers. Earlier this month, a leaked memo from Thailand's health ministry showed a comment saying that administering booster shots could dent public confidence in the Sinovac vaccine. Concerns over the efficacy of Chinese vaccines are also prompting countries to consider offering booster shots. Turkey and the United Arab Emirates are using Chinese vaccines, and they have already started administering booster shots. The World Health Organization, or WHO, has approved Chinese vaccines for emergency use, but Sinovac vaccines only have a 51% efficacy. That barely exceeds the WHO's requirement of 50% efficacy. And both China's Sinopharm and Sinovac are not making public their clinical trial data completely. The European Parliament passed a resolution on Thursday calling for a diplomatic boycott of the 2022 Beijing Winter Olympics, and it also calls on lawmakers to sanction Hong Kong officials. The resolution is in response to the closure of Hong Kong's pro-democracy newspaper Apple Daily and what lawmakers call the dismantling of the free society in Hong Kong. The resolution passed overwhelmingly, but it will not be binding. According to the South China Morning Post, the resolution urges the EU to slap targeted sanctions on Hong Kong officials, including Chief Executive Carrie Lam, among others. It also calls for targeted sanctions on Chinese officials responsible for undermining Hong Kong's freedoms. For example, the resolution names the director of the CCP's Hong Kong and Macau office and the head of the National Security Office. A committee in the UK Parliament is criticizing their government for not doing enough about the Chinese regime's genocide against Uyghur Muslims. In its report published Thursday, the Foreign Affairs Committee urged the British government to respect the Parliament's view on Xinjiang. In April, the UK Parliament declared genocide in China's Xinjiang region. The 11 Parliament members that make up the committee say the government's actions so far do not match its rhetoric and have proved ineffective, so a much stronger response is needed. They say products made by forced labor are being sold in the UK and urge ministers to explore the possibility of banning all cotton imports linked to Xinjiang. The committee says ministers should not attend the Beijing Winter Olympics and should urge others not to do so. The UK government is also being urged to ban equipment manufactured by Hikvision and other Chinese companies from the UK. Their security cameras are said to have been deployed in internment camps. The British Foreign Office says the UK government has led international efforts to hold China to account for its human rights violations in Xinjiang. But a spokesman says the government will carefully consider the findings of the report. And that's all for today's China in Focus. But before you go, we have a special episode coming up this Friday. During the Cold War, nuclear arms were at the heart of the U.S.-Soviet Union race.
Just by being there, these weapons deter others from aggression and thereby serve the cause of peace.
Today, the struggle between democracy and communism continues, but the focus has switched from nuclear arms to something much smaller, microchips.
It has dramatically enhanced the Chinese Communist Party's military capabilities, and it is now enough a threat for the United States.
Containing Beijing's rise in the chip industry,
it's like pulling out Beijing's sharpest teeth.
But with U.S. and China deeply intertwined.
It's hard to hurt China without hurting ourselves.
In part 2 of the special report, risks that could make America vulnerable and what we are doing to fix them. In part 2 of this special report, we talk about risks that could make America vulnerable and what we are doing to fix them. Be sure to check it out on Epoch TV this Friday at 9 p.m. China in Focus is partnering with a platform. That's where you can watch our exclusive content every Friday night. To subscribe, click epochtv.com/China in Focus. Thanks for watching and see you tomorrow.